Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm Director of Kolnagi Foundation. Welcome to Kolnagi Foundation Lates, talks with interesting people about new art exhibitions, publications and events in the UK and around the world. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Griffith, Mann and Andrea Achi from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Griffith is the curator in charge at the Medieval Department and at the Met Cloisters. Andrea is the assistant curator in the same department, and her speciality is late antiquity and the early medieval Mediterranean. Griff and Andrea are the co-curators of one of the areas of Crossroads, a display, as we're going to hear, of different cultures and different periods of art in the same spaces to look at them side by side. Griff and Andrea co-curated the installation in the medieval galleries, which is called Power and Piety. Griff and Andrea, welcome. First of all, tell me a little bit about the display so that people get a sense of what they might be looking at.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nicola, for your interest in this project. As you mentioned, this is a project that embraces not only the medieval galleries, but other locations in the Metropolitan Museum's main campus at Fifth Avenue. And the idea, I suppose, really began not long after the arrival of Max Holein as our director. And Max, I think, began thinking about the fact that although the Met is an encyclopedic museum in the sense that it has very broad collections, both in terms of chronology and geography, there's rarely ever a moment in the permanent collection galleries where visitors have, in one glimpse, a view of the scope of those collections. So as he began to get his feet under him as director, one of the things that we spoke about in the medieval galleries is how the galleries themselves, especially the main medieval sculpture hall, is very much at a crossroads within the institution. It's a major thoroughfare for visitors. And when Max gave us the assignment, so to speak, to develop an installation that would embrace that concept and cross the collections of the museum, there were three specific spaces identified for installations that would embrace the range of the Met's collections. So Andrea and I worked together on the Power and Piety installation, as you mentioned, but there are two other installations. One focuses on mythical creatures, which is at the space where the ancient Near East, Islamic, and Greek and Roman galleries come together. And then a second installation focuses on the trade that occurred in the early modern period between the New World, New Spain, and Asia, primarily through the Philippines. So as visitors traverse the building, the Crossroads installations in these three spaces all have a common graphic identity. But the physical presence of the Power and Piety installation in the medieval galleries is probably the most substantial just in terms of visual impact.
Should we look a little bit more in detail at the Power and Piety section?
Sure. The medieval sculpture hall is in many ways the kind of navel of the museum, in part because it occupies the site where the earliest building existed when the Met was first created. You know, it feels like a grand gallery space. It's primarily devoted to large-scale sculpture and to tapestries, but the installation that occupies the heart of the space is set apart by a different color from the rest of the gallery so that people recognize it as a specific intervention into that space. And it encompasses 12 different objects drawn from across the collections. Each one of the groups that we have developed features at least one medieval object, but the collections that are involved in terms of different departments of the museum include medieval, Africa, Asia, and Oceanic, Greek and Roman, Islamic, and European painting. So it's 12 works of art drawn from across 6 different curatorial departments, all from a range of time that we tend to think about when we think about the medieval period. So the early 4th century all the way up to the cusp of the 16th century.
How have you found visitors' reaction? Do you think new people are coming into those galleries that weren't spending much time there before?
You know, speaking anecdotally, one of the challenges that we face in the medieval galleries historically has been that we actually do get a lot of visitor traffic through those spaces, but often they're passing through on their way to other galleries and exhibitions. So one of our goals was really to create an installation that was encourage people to stop and look. And I would say that, yes, it is definitely the case now that people are stopping and spending time looking at these objects. And I think there is a degree of surprise because many of them look so different, especially those that are drawn from other areas of the collection, from the material that's normally on view in those spaces. What do you think, Andrea?
Yeah, absolutely. People have been stopping more in this space where, as Griff mentioned, usually people just walk through, and it's really nice to see lots of different visitors from 5-year-olds to older scholars and stop and really engage with these different objects that are unexpected in this space. And I think we're telling a lot of different stories that people don't know about the Middle Ages and different connections and how the Middle Ages was a vibrant period of movement. And so they're learning about this time period in a way that was difficult to tell within like the different silos of the institution. So I think it's surprising and unexpected, but it's also a true story of the Middle Ages that we haven't been able to tell.
So we've got divine authority here. You've got a Roman portrait head, haven't you, in marble? Tell me about the other objects. And they're all on this turquoise colored plinth, all facing different directions. Are they all pretty much the same time period? What is it that unites them?
So they're all very different, each in their own way, but they are, as you say, gathered together on a central platform that clarifies that these objects, although they're taken from different time periods and different cultures, we are trying to think about some of the themes that might connect them. So one of the first most impressive objects that people encounter right away is a monumental head of Constantine the Great, who sort of kicks off this grouping. And this grouping overall is really focused on how monumental sculpture was used in different cultures and time periods during the medieval era to create specific spaces and to develop relationships between broad audiences and works of sculpture that would be accessible in public spaces primarily. So in the case of Constantine, think of a piazza civic space, probably in Rome, whereas the figure from the ancient American collections, which is a great Mayan sculpture of Chak, the god of thunder and lightning, would have come from a temple. And that is also true of the 8-armed figure of Avalokiteshvara, who's the bodhisattva of infinite compassion, that's drawn from probably the Angkor Thom temple complex in Cambodia. And then the youngest sculpture in that group from the 14th century was made, we know, in 1345. So that's one of the works in this installation that's specifically dated, and was made for a female community of Beguines in the Low Countries. And it's striking to see how vibrant the tradition of monumental sculpture, and in some ways uninterrupted, in places like Cambodia and the new, call it the New World, but the ancient Americas, whereas there is a period of interruption in the tradition of monumental sculpture in Western Europe. So although you have things like the monumental head of Constantine being produced in the 4th century, if you go a few centuries forward, say into the 7th century, that tradition of monumental stone sculpture has more or less disappeared in Western Europe. So there are objects in this installation that allow people to think about these traditions of sculpture that we might take for granted in different ways, especially if you center that viewing experience in the European collections that surround this installation. One of the distinctions that we're so accustomed to, sacred and secular, these kind of binaries, is complicated. Although Constantine certainly is represented on a monumental scale to evoke the sense of imperial power that he embodies, there is still a sense in which the kind of authority that he derives is divinely inspired. So one of the interesting things about looking closely at Constantine, just to take that example, is the way in which his pupils are carved. He's really looking up towards the sky as if he's taking his authority from somewhere, outside of the terrestrial world. So these distinctions really, I think, are blended and blurred in interesting ways in these categories. The Virgin and Child figure, which is such an evocative figure for compassion and empathy, especially if you think about it being produced for a community of female religious that were really devoted to the care of sick and the administering of rites to the dying, which is one of the main focuses of the group that commissioned this work, connects in some ways to that bodhisattva of infinite compassion. And it's just a different visual language, but I think that there are these points of connections that stretch across time and geography in interesting ways. And that's, I think, one of the things that this installation tries to draw out.
Andrea, tell me about one of the displays that you've been involved in that you're particularly keen on.
Yeah, sure. I can talk about the venerator intermediaries.
Oh, yes, I like this one a lot.
Yeah, sure. And one thing that I want to bring up, and I was thinking about this as Griff was talking about the divine authority, is that the installation is so special because we can see the backs of the figures, of all these figures, and a lot of times that the sculpture are displayed close to the wall. The display in the medieval sculpture hall allows us to see these objects in a different way, and so that was one very exciting thing. Venerator Intermediaries is an installation with two works that were made around the 15th century. And they both are representations of Africans who lived in the medieval period. One represents an African in the medieval imagination, and another one represents a true African made in West Africa. And for their respective communities, these sculptures represented figures whose images played a central role in the transmission of belief, and they both acted as mediators between realms, such as heaven and earth, or past and present. And the artists carved these both pieces for shrines that were a focal point of prayer and veneration for the communities. And so here in the Crossroads installation, they're both out of the museum context because the medieval figure is actually from the cloisters, and it's one of the magi, and it's displayed with the other magi. And the African figure is from the African art galleries. And so it's interesting that we remove them from the museum context and put them in this conversation with each other.
That is interesting, because one of the problems with museums is that you've already removed something from its context.
I'm studying a lot about Africans in the Middle Ages, and so I was able to discuss this story in terms of the circulations of African communities in the medieval world. So we're just trying to tell new stories with these objects that the visitors might not have known before.
This pairing is one that I think we were particularly excited about, in part because with the African holdings of the museum, especially when you look at wooden sculpture, it's very rare to have something that might date as early as the 15th century. So to have this monumental figure from the Dogon culture that we could combine with a work of art that might have been produced around the same period, but in Germany, also featuring an African, as Andrea said, provides very different windows into the representational cultures coming out of two very different contexts. And yet at a moment when the African continent and Europeans were increasingly in contact with each other through trade and conflict in some cases.
And how much interpretation can you give? How much do you actually say about these different contexts on the labels?
Well, I think that was one of the real challenges of an installation like this is, you want as much of the work to be done visually as possible. And yet you also want to provide some cues as to why we were thinking about these objects together in the groups that we did. So there is a kind of overarching label that sets the table for people as to what this installation is all about, and the fact that it's one of three in the museum. And then there's an element of that overall introduction that explains the concept of power and piety. These are two ideas that we felt resonated not only for medieval material, but applied to the kinds of objects that we were hoping to feature from other cultures and time periods in this installation. And then each of these groupings also has a thematic label. So there are kind of three different layers, if you will. There's the one big idea. What is this installation? What is it trying to say? And then each of the groupings has its own thematic label that explains why these objects are together. And then each individual object has a label, but the individual objects' labels are rarely longer than, say, 100 words.
I imagine that the challenge is that people going into museums in Western European countries are so used to seeing objects which are very naturalistic, particularly pre-20th century art, where the major tradition was figurative and naturalistic. And then you compare it to an object which is produced around the same time, but in a culture which uses visual language in a very different way. So the challenge is that people leave behind their preconceptions and look at it through new lenses.
No, definitely it is a challenge. And I think with our labels, we try to explain the context of each object and recognize that people might have preconceptions, but tell them the artistic greatness of the particular object. So when they read the labels and they see the connection, they see that we're trying to tell a different story here versus the formal differences between the two objects. And one really great thing about this project is that we were able to collaborate with our colleagues from different departments. And so we had lots of discussions with our colleagues from African art department and Asian art, and they read the labels. And so it was through those discussions we decided what the individual labels would be. And it was a really collaborative effort.
So I can imagine those meetings must have been very, very interesting.
It's fascinating to think about this question, because I think there's a public perception on the one hand, and there's also the scholarship that's been done in each of these fields is really quite different in some of the concerns and issues that are addressed. And at the same time, there are these points of connection. I mean, ritual being one major fulcrum that obviously as medievalists we focus on very much, and also overlaps with some of the kind of work that someone in, say, the Department of Asian art or African art might be engaged in. But there are definitely different systems of scholarship that have grown up around these collections and objects. And I think one thing that this does is it definitely destabilizes this kind of Eurocentric model of how people look at things and the value systems that are embedded in the visual language of some of the objects that are coming out of a medieval Western European tradition versus, say, the African objects in the case of the pairing of the magus and the ancestor figure from the Dogon culture. And yet they're of similar scale. The techniques for manufacture sometimes overlap. The materials that are readily available sometimes are used in similar ways. And as Andrea said, it's wonderful to see these objects temporarily removed from their normal museum context and put in a very different setting, whether it's in the medieval galleries themselves or in these kinds of more focused conversations between objects. In this case, a pairing, but in some instances, it's 4 or 5 objects that are gathered together.
And is this something that the Met is planning to do in other exhibitions or in other parts of the collection?
I would say in a general sense, yes. I mean, I think Max Holine, our director, is very interested in thinking about not only how we can work internally more effectively across collections, but how that work is made visible to the public in different ways. I think that there's been a fair amount of collaboration around special exhibitions, and it tends to be the case that around the permanent collection galleries, that work has been primarily focused on individual departments kind of coming up with their design and installation concepts. But when this comes down, we will do another installation that brings in some of these new ways of working, especially around permanent collection galleries. I think we're all now thinking in new ways about those interfaces between our holdings, either in terms of proximity in time and in space in the building itself, or in thinking about ways in which we might be able to create unexpected bridges between cultures and time periods.
To what extent do you think this has been driven by the need to broaden out our perspectives and look at different cultures, responding to demand, presumably, from members of the public?
Yeah, I mean, just an initial reflection is that in our own field of medieval studies or medieval art history, there are definitely conversations that began several years ago now about what needs to be done to broaden the story of the Middle Ages, to focus on a more global moment, not just to stretch the boundaries of the geographic frame that we use, but to recognize the interfaces and contacts that produced medieval culture, that this isn't a phenomenon simply that's centered on the Mediterranean world or the Western European world, but rather that we need to think about this as one of the early moments of globalism and be able to tell those stories in compelling ways. I think museums historically have been able to do that more effectively in special exhibitions where there's maybe a greater appetite for risk. And I think what we're embracing now is a chance to try to bring some of that work out of the context of some of the special exhibition projects and reflect on how those stories can inflect our own presentation of collections in permanent collection gallery spaces.
What we're trying to do as medievalists is decenter narratives and correct narratives that have been presented. And what we're doing as well is showing these early globalisms that existed, and the fact that these communities were moving so much. And Africans, for example, were in Italy and in Spain during the 13th century, and we're trying to privilege these types of stories through our installations. It's helping people look at the Middle Ages in a different way.
One of the things I would add to what Andrea was saying is Andrea is actually working on a major international loan show that focuses on Byzantium and its relationship to Africa, specifically North Africa and kind of down the Red Sea coast, so Northeast Africa primarily. But I think when people think about the Byzantine Empire, they don't necessarily think about what a vital center places like Alexandria were, or other major cultural centers on the North African continent. And that's something that's scheduled for 2023 in the fall. So I think one of the exciting things about what's happening now is that there's a lot of really interesting work happening in museums as well as in universities that are opening up new questions about the medieval period. And as I said, I think our goal is to try to think about ways in which some of that research and some of those questions and lessons can come back into how we present our own material in the permanent collection galleries.
Thank you both so much. That was really fascinating, and I hope I get the chance to come and see the exhibition in the next year.